On the 26th of December 1900, 3 lighthouse keepers mysteriously disappeared from a tiny remote island in the North Atlantic, and not a single one of them has ever been found. The story of what was, or rather what wasn't found, has been told and retold for over a century. Some of what's been told is true, but some of it isn't. There's a version of the story that involves a dramatic logbook and 3 experienced men reduced to tears and a prayer. And while it's compelling, it's almost certainly fabricated. But strip all of that away, and what remains is strange enough on its own. 3 men vanished from a 17-acre rock surrounded by the North Atlantic. There were no bodies, no witnesses, and no explanation. Just the sea, the silence, and a mystery that no one has ever been able to fully resolve. This is the story of the Flannan Isles mystery and the terrifying silence of Eilean Mor. Eilean Mor in Gaelic means Big Island, although the name is something of an overstatement. It's roughly 17 acres of bare rock sitting about 20 miles west of the Isles of Lewis, the largest island in the Outer Hebrides. It rises 60 metres out of the North Atlantic and is part of a cluster of islets called the Seven Hunters, a name that feels, once you know the story, almost deliberately ominous. There are no trees on Eilean Mor, no shelter and no other inhabitants. Just wind, grass, seabirds, and the ruins of a small stone chapel built in the 7th century by an Irish monk named St. Flannan. That chapel is where the islands get their name. Long before the lighthouse was built, the island had a dark shadow lingering over it. For generations, shepherds from the Isles of Lewis would bring their sheep over to graze on the grass during the day, but they would always leave before dark. Always. They believed the island belonged to something else once the light faded. That something about the place was not to be trusted. Whether it was folklore or something else entirely, it was enough that no one tested it. By the late 1890s, the Seven Hunters had become a graveyard for passing ships, and in 1899, the Northern Lighthouse Board completed construction of a lighthouse on Eilean Mor. On the 7th of December that year, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse was lit for the first time, though it would not stay lit for long. 3 keepers were assigned to keep the light. Their lives worked in rotations, 6 weeks of isolation on the rock, followed by 2 weeks of shore leave. For the men assigned to Eilean Mor, it was a life measured in oil, weather, and the slow turning of weeks. James Ducat was the principal keeper. He was the anchor of the operation, steady, experienced, and deeply connected to the island. He'd actually lived on Eilean Mor for 14 months during its construction, watching the stone rise from the cliffs. Back on the mainland, he had a wife and 4 children waiting for him. He knew the risks better than anyone. Thomas Marshall was the assistant keeper. He was younger, wasn't married, and perhaps a little less settled. There was a smudge on his record, a previous fine for losing equipment during a storm. It was a small detail, but he was fined 5 shillings, which was a lot for a man in his position. Then there was Donald MacArthur, who was what they called an occasional keeper. Trained and certified, but brought in to fill gaps in the rotation rather than serving full-time. He was a local man from Lewis, but by trade, he was actually a tailor. There was also a 4th keeper, William Ross, who was on shore leave during this particular rotation. He was the lucky one, though for the rest of his life, luck would be a heavy word to carry. The 3 men began their shift in late November of 1900, and for several weeks the logbooks recorded daily life, cleaning the lenses, trimming the wicks, and watching the horizon. Then came December, and with December the weather turned. On the night of December the 15th, 1900, a steamer called the SS Arctur was making its way across the North Atlantic on a passage from Philadelphia to the port of Leith on Scotland's east coast. As the ship passed approximately 6 miles north of the Flannan Isles around midnight, Captain Holman stood on the bridge, his eyes scanning the horizon for the familiar sweeping pulse of the Flannan Lighthouse. It was a routine check, a heartbeat of safety in a dangerous sea. But there was no light, no beam, and no pulse, just a void in the middle of the ocean where a lighthouse should have been. Captain Holman noted it in the ship's log with a sense of unease, but he had a schedule to keep, so he pressed on. When the Arctur docked at Leith a few days later, the sighting was reported to the ship's agents. But for reasons that have never been explained, maybe the timing or perhaps the Christmas chaos, the information didn't reach the Northern Lighthouse Board until after Christmas Day. Meanwhile, the relief vessel Hesperus, captained by Jim Harvey, had been scheduled to reach Eilean Mor on the 20th of December, but severe weather prevented them from sailing and they didn't leave until the 26th. And so for 10 days the light on the Flannan Isles sat dark. Ships passed a blind hazard through the winter night. And whatever had happened to those 3 men, they were already gone. On the morning of December the 26th, the Hesperus finally pulled into the shadow of Eilean Mor. Captain Harvey was on edge before the anchor even dropped. The signal flag was missing. The landing stage was bare, which was unusual as it was always prepped with empty crates to be exchanged for supplies during a relief shift. Harvey sounded the ship's horn. The sound rolled against the cliffs and came back empty. Then he fired a flare, but the grey sky swallowed it. Joseph Moore was sent ashore alone. He climbed the path up 160 steps to the lighthouse. And by his own account, his heart was already racing before he reached the top. The main door was closed, but it was unlocked, so he went inside. He noticed the lamps had been cleaned, the oil reservoirs were full, and the last maintenance jobs had been done perfectly. But the fire in the grate had gone cold. Nothing remained but ash. The beds were neatly made, and the clock on the kitchen wall had stopped. The only living thing found in the lighthouse was a canary sitting quietly in its cage. 2 more sailors came ashore to help Moore search the rooms. That's when they found the first clue. A single set of oilskin weather gear, the kind every keeper relied on in rough conditions. It belonged to Donald MacArthur. Then the 3 men went to the west side of the island, and what they found there was a different kind of silence. The kind that was left behind by violence. The iron railings along the path to the west landing were bent and twisted like wire. The small railway track that ran down the slope to the landing, used to haul supplies up the cliffs, had been wrenched from its concrete foundations. And a wooden supply crate located around 33 metres above sea level, over 100 feet above the water, had been reduced to splinters, and its contents were scattered across the rocks below. The east landing, by contrast, was completely undisturbed. They searched every corner of that small island, but they found nothing. No bodies, no blood, no sign of struggle, and no further clue to what had happened to the 3 men. They had literally vanished from a 17-acre rock in the middle of the Atlantic without a trace. That evening, Captain Harvey sent a telegram to the Northern Lighthouse Board in Edinburgh. It said, "A dreadful accident has happened at Flannan's. The 3 keepers have disappeared from the island. The poor fellas must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane." He had already formed his theory, but the mystery had barely begun. In early January 1901, Robert Muirhead, the superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board, stepped onto the Flannan Isles rock of Eilean Mor to conduct a formal investigation. He wasn't there for ghost stories. He was there for facts. He examined the damage to the west landing, reviewed what remained of the lighthouse records, and interviewed the crew of the Hesperus, including Joseph Moore. But what he found in the logbooks was, in its own way, the most unsettling detail of all. The last entries in the logbook were completely ordinary. On the morning of December the 15th, the wind speed had been noted, routine tasks recorded, the lamp had been trimmed, the oil topped up, and the lens had been cleaned. Nothing in those entries suggested anything was wrong. According to the paperwork, it was just another Saturday on Eilean Mor. But we know that the light never reached the horizon that night. Between the calm morning entry and the midnight void reported by the SS Arctur, something had happened. In that narrow window of just a few hours, the 3 men vanished. Muirhead's conclusion was recorded in the official register of deaths for the district of Carloway on the Isles of Lewis. All 3 men were listed on the same page. Their cause of death was listed as probably drowning. The disappearances were officially classified as an accident. But the questions didn't go away. Why was the door unlocked? Why had MacArthur left his oilskins behind? And what could have possibly drawn 3 experienced men away from the light all at once? Standard procedure was clear on this point. One man always remained with the lamp. Always. And all 3 of them knew this. Before we look at what most likely happened, there's something worth addressing, because if you've come across this story before, you've probably heard a version of it that's considerably darker than what the records actually support. The version that circulates most often includes entries from Thomas Marshall's logbook, entries describing a storm so severe it seemed to break the men's spirits. Marshall reportedly described Ducat falling silent and withdrawn, and he reportedly described Donald MacArthur, a hardened, experienced man, weeping uncontrollably. And the final entry, dated December 15th, supposedly read, "Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all." It's a chilling detail, and it has been repeated so many times in so many places that it has become the version of the story that most people know. But here's the thing, those logbook entries don't exist. Later investigations conducted by researcher Mike Dash found that these entries were never in the official records. They were fabricated, most likely by a journalist or an author looking to give the story a sharper edge. They are essentially a piece of invented horror that managed to outlive almost everything else about the case. And in fact, the storm those entries describe wasn't even recorded in the weather logs for that period. The story was further shaped by a 1912 poem by Wilfred Wilson Gibson, which gave the world a haunting image of a chair knocked sideways and an untouched meal still sitting on the table. It's brilliant writing, but it was almost certainly fiction. It's easy to get lost in the ghost story version of the Flannan Isles, but the real story doesn't need ghosts or fake logs to be terrifying. When you strip away the poetry and the lies, you're left with something much more grounded, and in many ways, much more haunting. To understand how 3 men could vanish from a 60-metre cliff, we need to actually look at the bones of the island itself. Eilean Mor is scarred by geos, deep, narrow rock gullies that act like natural funneling systems. When the massive North Atlantic swell hits these channels, the water has nowhere else to go but up. It's compressed, pressurized, and then it explodes upwards with a force that has to be seen to be believed. Walter Albert, a Flannan Isles keeper in the 1950s, photographed the island during heavy weather. His images didn't show spray or mist, they showed solid walls of green water surging up and over the cliff tops that stood 60 metres above sea level. And on December the 15th, 1900, a woman miles away in the Isles of Lewis reported seeing exactly the same thing. A giant wall of water moving like a mountain across the horizon. So according to the evidence, this is the likely sequence of events. As the weather was turning, things were getting rough down at the West Landing, the kind of rough that puts equipment at risk. James Ducat and Thomas Marshall headed out to secure the gear. Marshall, remember, had a mark on his record for losing equipment to a storm once before, so he wasn't going to let it happen again. Inside the lighthouse, Donald MacArthur was watching, but he saw something. Maybe a swell from the gallery that made his blood run cold, or perhaps he heard the roar of a rogue surge hitting the geos. Whatever it was enough to make him run outside. He didn't stop for his coat, he didn't even stop to lock the door. He ran outside in his shirt sleeves, in a desperate, frantic attempt to warn his friends. He reached them just as a single surge compresses up through the geos and releases at the edge of the cliffs and slams into the West Landing. It would explain every piece of physical evidence found at the West Landing: the twisted iron railings, the supply crate that was destroyed, and the concrete foundations of the railway track that had been wrenched apart. And the 3 men that were standing on a path that they had dozens of times before was simply taken. No struggle, no blood, just an empty lighthouse and a canary singing in a silent room. This is the most widely accepted explanation. It fits the physical evidence. It explains why all 3 men were at the West Landing at the same time, which might otherwise seem strange. And it's consistent with what investigators found, or rather, what they didn't find. No bodies, no blood, and no struggle. Just 3 men who had disappeared. The official verdict of probably drowning may have satisfied the administrative records in Edinburgh, but on the Isles of Lewis and in the communities that knew these men, the file was never truly closed. The Northern Lighthouse Board struggled for years to find men willing to serve on the rock, and for those who did go, the island seemed to carry its reputation with it. A replacement keeper fell to his death from the same cliffs. Another reportedly lost his mind, broken by the isolation. Even William Ross, the man who had been on leave and cheated death, died years later while on duty at another station. Islands like this accumulate stories the way they accumulate salt. Other keepers reported hearing voices in the gales, cries that seemed to carry the names of Ducat, Marshall and MacArthur. Perhaps it was just the wind whistling through the geos, or perhaps it was the psychological weight of working in a tomb. But behind the ghost stories are the cold, hard facts of the lives cut short. James Ducat was 40 years old. He left behind a wife and 4 children, with the youngest being just 6 years old. Thomas Marshall, the man who just wanted to protect his record, left behind a grieving father and siblings. And Donald MacArthur, the tailor who ran out into the storm without a coat, left a wife and 2 children to wonder what his final moments were like. None of their bodies were ever recovered. The Atlantic rarely gives back what it takes. In 1971, the lamps of the lighthouse were automated. The last human keeper locked the door, walked down those 160 stone steps, and left the 7 hunters to the seabirds. Today, the light still flashes across the North Atlantic, powered by machines that don't feel the cold or hear the voices in the wind. The ruins of St. Flannan's Chapel still stand, watching over the West Landing, a place where the iron is still twisted and the mystery remains as deep as the ocean itself. In the end, what we're left with is a puzzle where most of the pieces fit, but the ones that remain missing are the ones that matter the most. The shattered equipment on the West Landing tells us what happened. The missing oilskins tell us where it happened, but they don't tell us why 3 men, trained in the strict protocols of the Northern Lighthouse Board, all stood on that cliff edge at the same time. Standard procedure was clear. 1 man stays with the light, always. For MacArthur to have run out without his coat in the biting December wind suggests a moment of pure, unfiltered urgency. Did he see a wave mounting in towards his friends? Did he hear a scream over the roar of the gales? We are left staring into a gap of a few seconds that history will never fill. The ghost stories and the forged logbooks tell us a lot about ourselves. We want there to be a supernatural reason. We want there to be a prayer and a premonition. Because the alternative is much harder to accept. That 3 experienced men did everything right and the ocean took them anyway. The real story isn't about ghosts. It's about the terrifying simplicity of the North Atlantic. It's about 3 men who went out onto a rock in the middle of the winter sea and simply disappeared. The light on Eilean Mor still flashes every night, but for those 3 men, the sun set over a century ago, and it never rose again.